Chapter 1. King Edward VII, the Playbear Prince. The story of King Edward VII begins not in a glittering ballroom, nor in the smoky haze of an exclusive gentlemen's club, but in the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace on a crisp November day in 1841. Born as Albert Edward, the second child and first son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, his arrival was met with the usual pomp that greeted a royal birth. He was not only a prince, he was the prince, the heir apparent, the future king of the British Empire, which at that time stretched across the globe in a patchwork of colonies, protectorates, and dominions that made it the largest empire in history. From the beginning, there was a tension between the life that Edward was expected to live and the life that Edward wanted to live. His parents were strict, moralistic, and, by Victorian standards, almost puritanical in their attitudes toward pleasure and indulgence. Queen Victoria, deeply influenced by her husband Prince Albert's sense of duty and moral rigor, believed that a monarch, and by extension the heir, should live as a model of upright, almost saintly virtue. But Edward, a Bertie, as his family called him, was not built for sainthood. He was built for society, for conversation, for charm, for laughter. His round face, warm smile, and easy manner made him naturally popular from a young age. He was intelligent enough, but he was no scholar. What he possessed instead was a kind of magnetic ease in human company, an instinct for making people feel comfortable, admired, even special. This skill would make him beloved in drawing rooms and parlors, and notorious in bedrooms. A childhood of restraint. Bertie's childhood was marked by rigorous discipline. His father insisted on a demanding schedule of lessons, covering not just history, politics, and languages, but also the moral sciences. Tutors noted that he was easily distracted, his mind wandering toward more entertaining pursuits. He had little patience for memorizing dates or reciting Latin declensions. Queen Victoria, in letters and diaries, often complained of her son's lack of seriousness. "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder," as she wrote after some trivial misbehavior. To her, Bertie's cheerful laziness was not just a flaw, it was a danger to the dignity of the throne. The young prince, meanwhile, found joy in escape, in walks, in horse riding, in talking to people outside the royal circle, and in the subtle thrill of breaking the smallest rules. He loved the company of actors, writers, and soldiers, people who lived life more loosely than the court demanded. Even as a boy, he seemed to know instinctively that he wanted to experience the world's pleasures, not merely read about them. The military interlude. In his early 20s, Bertie was sent on a tour of duty with the army, partly to instill discipline, partly to give him a taste of leadership. Instead, it gave him freedom. Away from his mother's watchful eyes, he discovered the camaraderie of officers' mess halls, the thrill of smoky billiard rooms, and the company of women who were far from the chaste image of Victorian womanhood. The most famous scandal of his youth erupted during his time at the Curragh camp in Ireland, where he allegedly had an affair with an actress. The rumours reached Queen Victoria, and she was appalled. Prince Albert, ill and already weakened in spirit, travelled to speak with his son, hoping to impress upon him the seriousness of royal responsibility. Within weeks, Albert fell gravely ill and died, and though there is no medical basis for the claim, Victoria never entirely forgave Bertie, believing the stress of his behaviour had hastened her husband's death. The heir without power. When Bertie returned to civilian royal life, he found himself trapped in a peculiar limbo. As the heir to the throne, he held immense prestige, yet no actual power. Queen Victoria, still in deep mourning for Albert, ruled for decades with an iron grip, keeping Bertie largely excluded from political affairs. Denied a meaningful role in governance, he poured his energy into society life. He travelled extensively, attending races in Paris, hunting in Germany, and wintering in the warm climates of the Mediterranean. Wherever he went, he cultivated friends among the aristocracy and wealthy elite, and often their wives. Edward was not conventionally handsome. By his 30s, he was stout, with a heavy moustache and an unmistakable belly. But his charm was disarming, his wit sharp but never cruel, and his ability to listen, truly listen, made him irresistible to many. He could make a duchess feel like the most important woman in the room, and a chorus girl feel like royalty. Paris and the pleasures of France. It was in Paris that Edward's reputation as a playboy prince truly took shape. Paris in the late 19th century was a city of glittering decadence, where the rigid moral codes of Victorian London were softened by French elegance and a certain shrugging acceptance of human desire. Edward became a regular at Maxim's, the famous restaurant where aristocrats, politicians, and courtesans mingled. He befriended actresses, singers, and dancers, many of whom became his companions in ways that were whispered about in both French salons and English newspapers. The French capital offered him not only women, but also exquisite food, fine wines, and the thrill of modern entertainments, from the newly fashionable cabarets to private gambling rooms. In these spaces, far from his mother's gaze, he could indulge without restraint. Affairs of the heart, and of the scandal sheets. Edward's affairs were numerous, and in many cases, public. His lovers included aristocrats such as Lady Randolph Churchill, the mother of Winston Churchill, and society beauties like Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick. Daisy, a woman of wit and ambition, was perhaps his most famous mistress. She would later attempt to sell letters from Edward, leading to a discreet but firm intervention by the royal household. Not all of Edward's dalliances were with women of noble birth. He was equally captivated by actresses and demi-mondaines, women who lived in the glittering half-light between respectability and scandal. These relationships blurred the lines between genuine affection and transactional companionship, but Edward seemed to thrive in them. Gossip followed him relentlessly, but in an era when newspapers avoided direct discussion of royal indiscretions, the stories remained tantalizingly veiled, enough to keep the public intrigued without ever crossing into open disgrace. The Royal Boudoir and the Siege d'Amour. Perhaps the most enduringly scandalous tale about Edward VII involves a certain piece of furniture, the so-called Siege d'Amour, or love seat, it commissioned during one of his stays in Paris. This specially designed chair allegedly allowed for intimate encounters without mussing his clothing, a detail that made its way into whispered anecdotes among the European elite. Whether apocryphal or not, the story became part of his legend, a symbol of his unapologetic enjoyment of physical pleasure. A king at last. When Queen Victoria finally died in 1901, Bertie was nearly 60 years old. He ascended the throne as Edward VII, and to the surprise of many, he proved a competent and popular monarch. His years of socializing had given him a deep understanding of diplomacy, and he used his personal charm to ease tensions between Britain and other European powers, earning the nickname a peacemaker. Yet even as king, he did not abandon his pleasures. The royal court under Edward became far more relaxed and cosmopolitan than under Victoria, with lavish parties, glittering state banquets, and an undercurrent of discreet but undeniable sensuality. The legacy of the playbeer king. Edward VII reigned for only 9 years, but his impact on the monarchy was profound. He modernized the image of the crown, making it less aloof and more connected to society. He also left behind a legacy of whispered tales, of lovers and late-night parties, of Parisian escapades and hidden letters. In the end, Edward embodied a contradiction, a king who took his ceremonial role seriously, yet never apologized for seeking personal pleasure. His reign was short, but his legend endures, the story of a man who was born into duty but lived for delight. Sultan Ibrahim I, the Mad Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. In the grand, gilded halls of the Ottoman palace, where the scent of rosewater drifted through marble corridors and the sound of dripping fountains echoed in shaded courtyards, there once lived a ruler whose reign became one of the most whispered about in the empire's long history. His name was Ibrahim I, but he would forever be remembered by a more infamous title, Ibrahim the Mad. To understand Ibrahim's story and the peculiar ways in which power, isolation, and indulgence shaped him, we must first picture the Ottoman court of the 17th century at its height. The empire stretched from the borders of Europe deep into Asia and North Africa, its armies feared, its wealth glittering like the domes of its mosques. In the heart of this vast dominion stood Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling complex of courtyards, harems, gardens, and imperial halls. Here, the Sultan ruled as an absolute monarch, commander of armies, dispenser of justice, and master of a realm whose population numbered in the tens of millions. But for young Ibrahim, palace life began not as a place of freedom and command, but as a prison of silk and gold. He was born in 1615, the son of Sultan Ahmed I and one of his favorite consorts, Kozum Sultan, a woman of extraordinary political skill and ambition. As the prince grew, the dangers of Ottoman succession politics surrounded him. In this world, a prince was not guaranteed safety. Instead, he was often locked away to prevent him from plotting against his reigning brother. Ibrahim spent much of his youth confined in the caves, literally in the cage, a set of secluded chambers in the palace where princes were kept under guard, cut off from the outside world. The walls were thick, the windows high and barred, and the only company came from a handful of servants and eunuchs. Days were filled with long silences, the muffled sounds of the palace beyond, and endless waiting. The boy who would become sultan learned early to distrust freedom, for freedom was dangerous, and to fear the outside world, for it might bring death. For years, Ibrahim lived this way. His elder brothers took the throne in turn, and each time a new sultan rose to power, the young prince feared he might be executed to secure the succession. This constant anxiety gnawed at him, feeding his tendency toward nervousness, suspicion, and deep emotional instability. When his brother, Sultan Murad IV, finally died in 1640, the call came for Ibrahim to leave his gilded prison. But he was so convinced it was a trick, a ploy to lure him out to be killed, that he refused to emerge until his mother, Kozum Sultan, swore repeatedly that Murad was indeed dead and the throne was truly his. Even then, he reportedly stepped out of the caves trembling, suspicious eyes darting about the room. Once on the throne, Ibrahim was in theory the most powerful man in the empire. In reality, his long years of isolation had left him emotionally fragile, deeply insecure, and susceptible to influence, especially from his mother and his favorite courtiers. At first, there was relief in the palace. The new sultan was not as harsh as his predecessor Murad IV, who had ruled with an iron fist, banning tobacco, alcohol, and coffee, and executing offenders without hesitation. Ibrahim seemed more pliable, more approachable. But soon, courtiers began to notice a strange restlessness in the man. Years of deprivation had created a hunger in him, not just for power, but for pleasure. The imperial harem, which had once been a place of mystery to him, now became his world. Filled with hundreds of women from across the empire, Greek, Circassian, Georgian, Persian, and more, the harem was a place of silken intrigue and whispered politics. For Ibrahim, it became a refuge, a playground, and eventually an obsession. Stories from the time, both in Ottoman chronicles and in European travelers' tales, describe Ibrahim's extravagant and unusual appetites. He is said to have spent hours selecting new concubines, seeking out women of striking beauty or unusual features. His court commissioned expensive fabrics, jewels, and perfumes to please them. In his desire to surround himself with beauty, he reportedly ordered that ships be sent to search far and wide for the most alluring women in the lands under his sway. One particularly famous tale, whether truth or embellished gossip, tells of Ibrahim's fascination with a woman of extraordinary size, reportedly weighing over 300 pounds. Entranced by her, he bestowed upon her titles, gifts, and vast influence in the palace. This woman became known as a shekaper or a piece of sugar, and her sway over the Sultan became the subject of endless harem gossip. Ibrahim's passions extended beyond individuals to grand gestures. He once ordered that the harem women be dressed entirely in furs, even in the height of summer, and paraded before him in a bizarre fashion display. On another occasion, he is said to have commanded that the palace's fish ponds be filled with perfume, simply so that he could watch his concubines bathe in scented water. While these indulgences may seem absurd, they reflected a deeper truth. Ibrahim's reign was marked by a detachment from political realities. While his empire faced military and financial challenges, the Sultan retreated further into personal pleasures. Government decisions were often delegated to his mother, Kozum Sultan, or to viziers who learned to manipulate his desires to secure their own power. But Ibrahim's excesses also had darker sides. Chroniclers accused him of sudden bursts of violence and paranoia. Some claimed he had concubines drowned on mere suspicion of betrayal. Others wrote that he ordered vast sums from the treasury for his personal amusements, draining resources needed for the empire's defense. And yet, amid the chaos of his personal life, Ibrahim fathered numerous children, ensuring a line of succession. His sons would go on to shape the empire in their own ways, though his own reign would end in tragedy. By 1648, after 8 turbulent years on the throne, his erratic behavior had alienated the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman troops, and many in the palace. Discontent swelled. When economic troubles deepened and military defeats loomed, patience with the Sultan's extravagances ran out. That year, a coup was launched. The Janissaries stormed the palace, demanding Ibrahim's removal. He was deposed and returned, ironically, to the very same caves where he had spent his youth. His 9-year-old son, Mehmed IV, was placed on the throne, with Kozum Sultan once again wielding political power as regent. But Ibrahim's enemies feared leaving him alive. Later in 1648, he was strangled in his chambers, the fate he had feared all his life. His death marked the end of one of the most peculiar and scandal-filled reigns in Ottoman history. Today, Sultan Ibrahim I is remembered less for military conquests or political reforms than for the strange blend of luxury, obsession, and instability that defined his rule. He remains a cautionary tale of how isolation, fear, and unchecked indulgence can shape a monarch and an empire. Chapter 3: King Charles II, the Merry Monarch. In the tapestry of British history, no king's reign is more vividly coloured with laughter, love, scandal, and the scent of expensive perfume than that of Charles II. If Henry VIII was the thunderous storm that reshaped England with force, Charles was the warm, intoxicating summer breeze that lured the nation into pleasure after decades of cold, joyless rule. He was called the Merry Monarch for good reason. His court pulsed with life, wit, and seduction. But behind the smiles and the masks was a man who had been shaped by exile, civil war, and the sharp knowledge that power is fleeting and life is short. A prince without a throne. Charles was born on May 29, 1630, in St. James's Palace, the eldest surviving son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. He grew up in a court that was elegant but increasingly divided by politics. His father, a man of deep belief in the divine right of kings, was at odds with Parliament, and those tensions would eventually erupt into the English Civil War. When Charles was still a boy, the war began to swallow the country. By his early teens, he was serving as the symbolic figurehead of the royalist cause, travelling with his father's supporters and learning, perhaps too young, the art of political charm. But the tides of war turned against the monarchy. In 1649, when Charles was only 18, his father was captured, tried, and executed, an event that sent shockwaves through all of Europe. For Charles, it was both a personal and political catastrophe. He was now King of England in name, but without a kingdom to rule. Years in exile. After his father's execution, Charles fled to the continent. For the next 9 years, he lived as a wandering king-in-waiting, moving between the courts of France, the Netherlands, and Spain. These were formative years, not just in survival, but in cultivating the arts of seduction, diplomacy, and the careful balancing of loyalty and convenience. At the French court, Charles learned the glittering manners and gallantry of Louis XIV's nobles. He absorbed their style, the flowing wigs, the rich silks, the graceful dance of flattery and flirtation. In the Netherlands, he mingled with merchants and military men, adopting a more pragmatic edge. And everywhere, he learned the quiet lesson of exile. When you have no power, charm becomes your currency. Charles also learned to live for pleasure during these years. He was tall, over 6 feet, rare for the time, with dark, curling hair, expressive eyes, and a lazy, cat-like grace that women found irresistible. He never lacked for romantic company, even without a crown. The Restoration. In 1660, after years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell and then his son Richard, the English people were weary of austerity. The rigid moral codes, the closed theatres, the banning of Christmas celebrations, all had drained the joy from public life. When the monarchy was restored, Charles returned in triumph. His arrival in London was a carnival. Crowds lined the streets, cheering and throwing flowers. Bonfires lit the night. For many, Charles's return symbolized the return of music, laughter, and the possibility of pleasure. He wasted no time in making that symbolism real. A court of splendor and scandal. Charles's court became the most glittering in Europe. He reopened the theatres, encouraged the arts, and invited back the musicians and actors who had been banished under Puritan rule. He patronized writers like John Dryden and scientists like Robert Hooke, creating an atmosphere of intellectual as well as sensual stimulation. But it was the king's own personal life that fascinated the public most. Charles had a marriage to Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, but it was a political union, and Catherine, though dignified and devout, did not capture the king's passions. His real romantic life unfolded with his many mistresses, who were as much a part of the Restoration Court as ministers and ambassadors. The royal mistresses. The list of Charles II's lovers is long, but several stand out as central figures in his reign. Barbara Vierce, Countess of Castlemaine, bold, voluptuous, and unapologetically ambitious, Barbara was one of Charles's earliest and most notorious mistresses. She bore him several children and used her influence to enrich herself and her allies. Her open contempt for the Queen and her dominance over the king's affections made her a figure both feared and envied. Nell Gwynn, perhaps the most beloved of Charles's mistresses, Nell was a former orange seller turned actress. Witty, down-to-earth, and genuinely affectionate toward the king, she won the public's heart as the Protestant whore, a tongue-in-cheek reference to her contrast with the Catholic mistresses in Charles's life. Louise de Keroualle, a French beauty sent, perhaps, as a political agent by Louis XIV, Louise was elegant, calculating, and skilled in the subtler arts of influence. She became a duchess and a key figure in Anglo-French diplomacy. Charles acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children by various mistresses, giving them titles and estates. In this, he broke with his father's stiff formality. He saw no shame in his pleasures, only the necessity of discretion. The king's tastes. Charles's pleasures were not limited to women. He loved the theatre, racing, sailing, and elaborate court masques. He was known for walking the streets of London in disguise, mingling with commoners, listening to gossip, and sometimes flirting openly with shopgirls and tavern maids. He also had an unusual fondness for animals, particularly his spaniels, a breed that still bears his name, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. His apartments were filled with pets, and he would sometimes allow them to disrupt important meetings, much to the annoyance of his ministers. Food, too, was a passion. Unlike his Puritan predecessors, Charles enjoyed lavish feasts with French wines, exotic spices, and the finest roasts. He was a man of appetites, and he saw no reason to hide them. Politics and pleasure. While his love life made headlines, or their 17th century equivalent, Charles was also an adept politician. He managed to navigate the religious tensions of his day, balancing the demands of a largely Protestant parliament with his own Catholic sympathies. He played France and the Dutch Republic against each other, securing funds and alliances to maintain his relatively fragile position. His reign was not without crisis. The Great Plague of 1665, the Great Fire of London in 1666, and wars with the Dutch all tested his rule. But Charles had a remarkable ability to deflect blame and maintain his popularity, often with a smile and a wry remark. The end of the merry reign. By the 1680s, Charles's health began to fail. Years of indulgence, combined with the stress of political intrigue, took their toll. He died suddenly in 1685, likely from a stroke, and on his deathbed converted to Catholicism, a final act of defiance against the Protestant establishment that had always tried to control him. He left behind no legitimate heir. The crown passed to his brother James II. But Charles's illegitimate children went on to play major roles in European history, their bloodlines mingling with the great houses of the continent. The legacy of the merry monarch. Charles II's reign is remembered as a golden age of wit, art, and open pleasure. He was not a faithful husband, nor a particularly moral man by Puritan standards, but he understood something essential about human nature. People crave joy as much as justice. After decades of repression, he gave England back its laughter. He remains a figure of fascination because he seemed to live without regret, a king who embraced his vices, adored his lovers, and believed that the business of monarchy included the pursuit of delight. Chapter 4. King Farouk of Egypt, the gluttonous playbear. There are kings who are remembered for their wisdom, kings remembered for their cruelty, and kings remembered for their reforms. Then there is King Farouk of Egypt, who is remembered, above all else, for his appetite, for food, for possessions, for women, for anything and everything that caught his eye. His reign was a flamboyant spectacle of extravagance, scandal, and indulgence, unfolding at a time when Egypt was wrestling with deep political change. If Edward VII was a playboy with charm, and Charles II a merry king of wit, Farouk was a man who lived in a fever of acquisition, wanting not just pleasure, but everything. A prince in a golden cage. Farouk was born on February 11, 1920, in the Abdeen Palace in Cairo, the only son of King Fuad I of Egypt and Queen Nazli. From the moment of his birth, Farouk's life was steeped in luxury. The young prince had silk sheets, gold-plated toys, and personal attendants who hovered over his every move. His childhood was one of isolation from ordinary life. He never knew the feeling of handling coins to buy something, never tasted food that wasn't prepared by a royal chef, never saw a day without a servant waiting to serve. But such luxury also came with pressure. As the heir to the throne, Farouk was expected to embody the dignity and leadership of Egypt's monarchy. His father, stern and controlling, was determined to shape him into a ruler worthy of the Khedive and royal tradition. An education abroad. Farouk's formal education took him abroad. In 1935, at the age of 15, he was sent to England to attend the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. The intention was to prepare him with the discipline, strategy, and leadership skills of an officer. But Farouk's time in England was not simply about study. Away from Egypt's watchful palace guards, he discovered the pleasures of Western nightlife, fine dining, fashionable clothes, parties with British aristocrats, and the thrill of spending freely. He was tall, with smooth, youthful features, and had a natural charisma that drew attention. While still technically a student, he was already beginning to live like a king. His education was cut short when his father died in 1936. At just 16 years old, Farouk returned to Egypt to take the throne. A young king adored. When Farouk was crowned, Egypt greeted him with an outpouring of affection. He was young, handsome, and seen as a symbol of a new era. Crowds cheered him in the streets, newspapers printed glowing accounts of his charm, and songs were written in his honor. At first, Farouk played the role well. He attended public events, spoke warmly of his love for Egypt, and promised to improve the lives of his people. He was careful to project the image of a devoted monarch, but behind the palace walls, his indulgent nature was already growing stronger. The appetite for possessions. Farouk had a passion for collecting, though a hoarding might be a better word. He acquired cars and fleets, often purchasing the latest models in multiple colors. He collected jewels, gold watches, and luxury pens in staggering numbers. He had an entire room in the palace dedicated to his collection of coin-operated vending machines, which he would sometimes fill with toys or trinkets and amuse himself by playing with. His shopping sprees were legendary. In Europe, he would descend upon jewelers, buying dozens of watches at once. In Cairo, he would visit shops after closing hours and demand private showings, purchasing entire shelves of merchandise. He once famously acquired a complete set of medieval armor, for no practical reason other than that he liked the look of it. The appetite for food. Farouk's indulgence in food was equally excessive. He was known to consume vast meals, multiple courses heavy with meats, sweets, and pastries, and to eat late into the night. His love of rich dishes contributed to his expanding waistline. As the years passed, the once handsome young king became increasingly overweight, a fact that did not escape the public's notice. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, but widely repeated, of Farouk consuming whole roast lambs, mountains of desserts, and enormous platters of exotic delicacies in a single sitting. He was known to carry candy in his pockets and eat constantly throughout the day. The appetite for women. Farouk's romantic life was as indulgent as his taste for possessions and food. He married Safanaz Zulfikar, later renamed Queen Farida, in 1938, in a lavish ceremony attended by thousands. At first, the match seemed happy, and the couple had 3 daughters together. But Farouk was not a faithful husband. The king's affairs were numerous, ranging from fleeting encounters with dancers and actresses to longer relationships with women of high society. His appetite for women was so well known that it became part of his public image. He pursued women with the same relentless desire he showed for luxury goods, often without regard for discretion. In later years, Farouk divorced Queen Farida and married Nariman Sadak, a 17-year-old beauty who became Egypt's last queen before the monarchy's fall. The appetite for power and its erosion. Though Farouk enjoyed the privileges of kingship, he was less enthusiastic about its responsibilities. Corruption in the government grew under his reign, and his lavish spending stood in stark contrast to the poverty many Egyptians faced. His popularity began to wane as stories of his excess spread. World War II brought further challenges. Egypt, though officially neutral, was of strategic importance to both the Allies and Axis powers. Farouk's perceived favoritism toward the Axis, including an infamous incident where he refused to declare war on Germany until 1945, damaged his international reputation. By the late 1940s, dissatisfaction with Farouk's rule had reached dangerous levels. His gambling, extravagant trips abroad, and failure to address Egypt's political unrest eroded public trust. The fall of the king. In July 1952, the Free Officers Movement, led by Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, staged a coup. Farouk, caught off guard, abdicated in favor of his infant son, Ahmed Fuad II. But the monarchy's days were numbered. Within a year, Egypt was declared a republic. Farouk left Egypt aboard his royal yacht, taking with him a staggering collection of jewels, gold, and other valuables. Exile, for Farouk, did not mean frugality. He continued to live lavishly in Europe, frequenting casinos, dining extravagantly, and surrounding himself with companions. The end in exile. Farouk spent his final years in Italy, growing heavier and increasingly reclusive, though he never abandoned his indulgent lifestyle. On March 18, 1965, he died suddenly in a Rome restaurant after a massive meal. Some suspected poisoning, others a heart attack brought on by years of excess. Whatever the cause, his death seemed almost poetically tied to the life he had lived, sudden, dramatic, and surrounded by the trappings of indulgence. The legacy of appetite. Today, Farouk is remembered as a cautionary tale, a man who inherited a kingdom and treated it like a private playground. His reign is often summed up in stories of gluttony and greed, but there was also a tragic dimension. He was a king born into a changing world where the old glamour of monarchy was fading. Farouk's Egypt was the last gasp of a royal age, and he played his role to the hilt, never pretending to be anything other than what he was, a man who wanted more. Chapter 5. King Louis XV of France, the lustful son's shadow. This will be the same slow, uninterrupted, richly detailed style you like, over 8,000 words, unfolding like a long, whispered bedtime history lecture. I'll guide you through his life from childhood, to court intrigues, to the secret rooms of Versailles, always keeping the pacing gentle enough for sleep, yet still rich with historical colour. Chapter 5. King Louis XV of France, the lustful son's shadow. It was the winter of 1715 when the great Sun King, Louis XIV, finally closed his eyes for the last time. His reign had lasted for over 70 years, and his presence had been so dominant, so dazzling, that the very idea of France without him felt strange, even to those who disliked him. His great-grandson, a small, quiet, and somewhat sickly boy named Louis, suddenly found himself heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. He was not yet 6 years old. The child had been born into the golden halls of Versailles, but unlike his great-grandfather, he had no memory of simpler days. To him, the gilded ceilings, the echoing marble corridors, and the perfumed gardens were not symbols of power, they were simply home. The boy's early years were marked by uncertainty. France had been left exhausted by endless wars and crushing debts, and while Louis XIV had been a figure of supreme authority, his passing left a gap that many were eager to fill. The regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, ruled on the young king's behalf, and Versailles entered a period of moral looseness. The regent was notorious for his own indulgences. And the court began to shift from the rigid ceremonial order of Louis XIV to something far more relaxed and far more decadent. This atmosphere was to shape the young Louis XV deeply. As he grew, he learned the rituals of kingship, the morning lever, the endless processions, the delicate balancing of court factions, but he also absorbed the unspoken truth of Versailles, that behind the glittering facade. The real business of the palace was not governance, but pleasure. Louis came of age in a France that was changing. The Enlightenment was stirring. Philosophers whispered about reason, liberty, and progress. Yet in Versailles, time moved differently. There, the clock ticked to the rhythm of music, flirtation, and whispered intrigues in candlelit salons. By the time Louis reached his teenage years, courtiers were already remarking on his physical beauty. He had soft, almost delicate features, and eyes that seemed perpetually half-lidded, as if amused by some private thought. Women at court took notice, and although he was still young, the idea of Louis as an object of desire began to take root. When he was 15, he was married to the Polish princess Marie Leszczyńska. She was kind, devout, and unfailingly polite, everything a queen was supposed to be. Yet she was also 6 years older than him, and their marriage, while cordial, lacked a certain spark. Louis did his duty. They would eventually have 10 children together, but he was restless. The ceremonial life of a king was stifling. and Louis began to seek diversions elsewhere. At first, his affairs were discreet, conducted with the practiced subtlety that the French court had perfected over centuries. A lady-in-waiting here, a nobleman's wife there. But as the years passed, Louis's appetite grew bolder. He was not content with the occasional dalliance. He craved novelty, excitement, and the thrill of secrecy. Versailles, with its endless supply of ambitious young women eager for royal favor, provided fertile ground. By the 1740s, Louis had established a system for his pleasures that was as organized as any department of state. He took mistresses not only from the nobility but also from the world beyond, actresses, singers, and sometimes even women of humble origins. His most famous mistress was, of course, Madame de Pompadour, who captured his heart not merely with her beauty but with her intelligence. She became his confidant, advisor, and cultural patron, introducing him to Enlightenment thinkers and championing the arts. Yet Pompadour's health began to fail, and Louis, still in his prime, turned increasingly to younger companions to satisfy his physical desires. In a discreet building near the palace, known as the Parc aux Auxiliaires, he kept a rotating selection of women, chosen for their youth and beauty, and housed at royal expense. For Louis, this was not merely about lust, it was about control, about surrounding himself with beauty and submission in a world where political life was becoming increasingly turbulent. The Parc aux Auxiliaires became a kind of whispered legend in France. Commoners could only imagine what went on behind its closed doors, but rumors spread, stories of lavish banquets, silken beds, and the king slipping away from court to indulge in his private world. His enemies seized upon these tales, portraying him as a man lost in vice while the kingdom suffered. In truth, Louis was capable of moments of compassion and generosity, but his priorities were increasingly personal, not political. By the 1750s, France was struggling under the weight of costly wars, including the disastrous 7 Years' War, which drained the treasury and tarnished French prestige. But inside Versailles, the chandeliers still glittered, and Louis still sought the comfort of soft voices and perfumed hair. He was aging now, his once youthful face beginning to show the lines of middle age, but he remained devoted to his pleasures. As his reign went on, the gap between the king and his people grew wider. Pamphlets circulated mocking him as Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the Well-Beloved, with heavy irony. In the salons of Paris, philosophers spoke of reform, of the need for a ruler who cared more for the people than for his own indulgences. But at Versailles, the days passed in a golden haze, and Louis drifted further into the world he had built for himself. His death in 1774 was not marked by the overwhelming grief that had accompanied his great-grandfather's passing. The people remembered him less as a statesman and more as a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of pleasure. Yet for those who had known him personally, there remained the memory of a king who, for all his flaws, had a certain warmth, a charm that could make one forget, if only for a moment, the burdens of the world. In the quiet after his passing, Versailles stood as it always had, magnificent, glittering, and haunted by the ghosts of kings. The Parc aux Auxiliaires fell silent, its rooms empty, its silk sheets gathering dust. But the legend of Louis XV, the king who had tried to live as though pleasure could hold back the march of time, lingered on. Chapter 6: King Christian VII of Denmark, Madness and Desire. The story of Christian VII is unlike that of any other king in this series. He was not merely a ruler with unusual tastes or unrestrained indulgences. He was a man whose reign became a living theatre of madness, vulnerability, and scandal. His life unfolded in the mid to late 18th century, in a Denmark court between old feudal traditions and the slow rise of Enlightenment ideals. Yet within the gilded halls of Copenhagen, behind the tall windows of Christiansborg Palace, a storm brewed, not the kind driven by political revolution, but by the chaotic and unpredictable impulses of a king who seemed perpetually caught between fantasy and reality. Christian VII was born on the 29th of January, 1749, into a royal court that was elegant on the outside yet cold on the inside. His father, King Frederick V, was known for his drinking and easy charm. His mother, Queen Louise of Great Britain, was gentle but passed away when Christian was just a boy. That loss, they said, marked him deeply, a wound that perhaps never healed, manifesting later in erratic behavior and unpredictable moods. From his earliest years, courtiers noticed that the young prince seemed different. He could be bright and sharp one moment, then withdrawn or strangely distant the next. In a world where kings were expected to project unwavering authority, such temperament was viewed not merely as odd but dangerous. His childhood education was rigid, drilled into him by tutors who valued obedience over curiosity. The boy learned to repeat what was told, but rarely seemed to engage with it. He would sometimes recite lessons while staring blankly at the wall, as though his mind was wandering somewhere far from the room. By the time he ascended to the throne in 1766 at the age of just 17, whispers had already circulated. The new king was unstable. But instability alone was not what made his reign infamous. It was the way it combined with his youthful appetites. Christian VII was, at heart, a sensualist. Almost from the moment he became king, his interest in affairs of state was minimal. Court meetings bored him. Signing decrees felt tedious. But the company of women, that was another matter entirely. His court quickly filled with rumors of escapades that would have been scandalous for even the most discreet monarch. The new king roamed the taverns of Copenhagen at night, often in disguise, seeking encounters with actresses, dancers, and women of the streets. These adventures were whispered about in the grand salons the next morning, often in tones of disbelief. Yet there was something almost boyish in the way he sought pleasure, less the calculating seductions of a seasoned libertine, more the restless searching of someone never quite satisfied, never quite grounded. He had favorite mistresses, but he did not keep them long. When he tired of one, he would move on quickly, often without explanation. It was said he preferred novelty above all else, as though the thrill of the first meeting was the only part that truly mattered. Christian married Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the younger sister of King George III, in a union meant to strengthen the ties between Denmark and Britain. She was just 15 at the time, intelligent, lively, and unprepared for the chaos she was about to encounter. At first, Christian treated her with the easy charm he could muster when he wished, but before long, the Queen realized that her husband was more interested in the pleasures of the city than in her company. Their marriage was strained from the start, and soon enough, the king's absences became conspicuous. What truly made Christian VII's reign notorious was the intersection of his personal instability with the politics of the court. His mental health was fragile, with episodes that today might be recognized as severe mental illness, but at the time was seen through the lens of 18th-century superstition and judgment. There were days when he would refuse to speak to anyone, pacing the palace halls for hours, muttering under his breath. Other times, he would burst into fits of laughter during solemn events, or abruptly leave state dinners to chase after a serving maid who had caught his eye. The scandal deepened with the arrival of Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who became the king's personal doctor, and soon his closest advisor. Struensee was a man of the Enlightenment, well-read and reform-minded. Initially, his role was to manage Christian's mental and physical health, but he quickly gained enormous influence over the young king. It was Struensee who began running much of the government in Christian's name, introducing modern reforms that alarmed the conservative nobility. But Struensee's influence extended beyond politics, and straight into the Queen's chambers. The relationship between Struensee and Queen Caroline Matilda became the great scandal of the age. In the cold reality of her marriage, the Queen found warmth in the company of the physician. They were discreet at first, but eventually their closeness became impossible to hide. The court buzzed with rumours that the Queen and Struensee shared long, secret walks in the gardens, that they exchanged notes hidden in books, that the Queen's second child might not have been the King's at all. Christian himself seemed oddly unbothered at times, perhaps too detached from reality to grasp the full weight of the betrayal, or perhaps relieved to have someone else managing the burdens of court life. But the nobility saw in Struensee not just a scandal, but a political threat. Here was a foreigner, controlling the king, sleeping with the queen, and pushing reforms that undermined their traditional power. In January 1772, the coup came. Struensee was arrested, charged with treason and adultery, and executed in a gruesome public spectacle. Queen Caroline Matilda was sent into exile, never to see her children again, and she died only a few years later in her mid-20s. Christian VII remained king in name, but his power was hollowed out. From that point on, he was a figurehead, his actions closely managed by a regency led by his stepmother and later by his son. Yet even in his diminished state, Christian continued to drift in and out of reality. He spent long hours alone, or with a select few attendants, sometimes talking about events from years earlier as if they had just happened. His pleasures became simpler, playing with his dogs, listening to music, but now and then, the old restless appetite for women would flicker back to life, leading to quiet arrangements by the courtiers to satisfy him without public embarrassment. Christian VII died in 1808, having been king for over 4 decades, though for much of that time, he was little more than a shadow on the throne. History remembers him not for conquests or grand political achievements, but for the strange mix of fragility and indulgence that defined his reign. His story is both sad and scandalous, a portrait of a man caught between the weight of a crown and the chaos of his own mind, who sought in fleeting pleasures the stability he could never find in himself. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath all the gossip and scandal. Christian VII's desires, however scandalous they appeared, were less about power over others and more about a desperate attempt to fill the emptiness inside. In the gilded isolation of kingship, pleasure can become a refuge, and for Christian, it was a refuge he sought again and again, until his life slipped quietly into history. Chapter 7. King Philip IV of Spain. Lavish vice behind closed doors. The year was 1621, and Spain was a land both glorious and burdened. It was the height of the Spanish Empire, yet its glory came with the weight of an overstretched realm. Silver from the Americas flowed into the royal treasury like a river of light, but debts and wars consumed it as quickly as it arrived. Beneath this grand stage stood a man who, at only 16 years old, inherited the vast empire from his father, King Philip IV. At first glance, Philip seemed every inch the ideal monarch, tall, fair-haired, and solemn-faced, with the unmistakable Habsburg jawline that told of centuries of dynastic power. His early portraits painted him as almost saint-like, draped in black silk with a silver cross at his chest, the embodiment of Spanish Catholic dignity. Yet, behind those portraits, in the gilded chambers of Madrid's Alcázar Palace, a very different life unfolded, one of quiet excess, indulgence, and pleasures hidden behind embroidered curtains. Philip was a man caught between two identities, the public king, pious and devoted to the grandeur of Spain, and the private man, restless and easily drawn to temptation. In public, he sat through endless council meetings with ministers who droned on about war with the Dutch or the latest tax burdens. In private, however, his gaze would drift toward the young ladies of the court, the scent of orange blossoms and perfume pulling him away from thoughts of diplomacy. The palace itself seemed built for indulgence. Its corridors were lined with tapestries from Flanders, depicting scenes of hunts and banquets, their woven threads almost alive in the dim candlelight. Chamber after chamber opened onto secret antechambers, rooms designed for whispered meetings and stolen moments. And it was here, away from the eyes of ambassadors and cardinals, that Philip's more human appetites played out. One of his earliest and most notorious entanglements was with Maria Calderón, a gifted actress known as a La Calderona. She was quick-witted, with deep, dark eyes that sparkled under the candlelight of Madrid's theatres. The court was scandalized when rumors began to swirl of her private meetings with the king. Philip, still in his 20s, found her humor and daring irresistible, and their relationship became the subject of whispered gossip that traveled from the royal kitchens to the streets of Madrid. They even had a child together, though the child was sent away to be raised quietly, as was the royal custom for such matters. But Maria was only the beginning. Philip had an almost compulsive need for romantic conquest. He was not loud or brazen about it like some kings. Instead, he was discreet, careful, and methodical. Letters were passed through trusted servants, trysts arranged in secluded palace gardens where the sound of fountains masked footsteps. His love of the theatre only deepened his exposure to actresses, dancers, and courtesans, whose company he enjoyed almost as much as the applause of a good performance. Philip's indiscretions might have been kept better hidden if not for the constant swirl of court intrigue. Spain's royal court was a place where a raised eyebrow or a casually dropped phrase could set off weeks of speculation. Courtiers kept detailed mental notes of who entered which room and at what hour. Servants whispered stories to one another in the servants' hall, exaggerating every detail until the truth became tangled in a net of rumor and scandal. Despite this, Philip maintained a careful balance. He never allowed his private indulgences to completely overshadow his public duties, though many historians argue that his endless affairs distracted him from the political realities of his empire. While he entertained himself in the palace, Spain's armies were losing ground in the 30 Years' War, and the once mighty fleet suffered defeats. Yet in Philip's mind, his private life was a refuge from the crushing burden of ruling an empire that stretched across the known world. His tastes in luxury went beyond romance. Philip adored grand banquets, long tables covered in golden platters of roasted game, marzipan sculptures, and towers of sugared fruit. He was a patron of the arts, commissioning countless paintings from Diego Velázquez, who became not only his court painter but also his confidant. In many ways, Velázquez's portraits of the king tell a quiet story of the toll such a double life took. In early paintings, Philip's eyes are bright and his posture commanding. In later works, his expression is heavier. Wearied by both the burdens of the crown and the excesses of his own desires. There is a certain irony to Philip IV's life. He ruled during what is often called Spain's Siglo de Oro, the golden century of art and literature, yet his personal legacy is often remembered less for political achievements and more for the dozens of illegitimate children he fathered. The quiet scandals of the court, and the way his reign symbolized both the splendor and the slow decline of Spain's imperial power. By the time he was older, Philip's romantic pursuits had mellowed, replaced by a more reflective melancholy. Many of the women who had once graced his private chambers were gone, and the empire he had inherited was crumbling at the edges. He would spend long hours in his private apartments, the sound of a distant guitar drifting through the open windows, staring at the paintings Velázquez had made of him in his youth. Perhaps in those quiet moments, he thought about the way history would remember him, as both the pious king in the black doublet and the man who, behind closed doors, indulged in life's sweetest temptations. In truth, Philip IV was a man who embodied the contradictions of kingship, a ruler of vast territories who could not resist the pull of human desire, a patron of high art who also revelled in low pleasures. A monarch who lived behind walls of gold yet longed for the simple warmth of private company. And so, in the annals of history, his reign is a reminder that even the most powerful kings were, in the end, as flawed and human as those they ruled. Chapter 8. King Frederick William II of Prussia, Music, Mistresses, and Mayhem. It is the year 1786 in Berlin. The air is thick with the scent of change, though few realize yet just how different the court will feel within the next months. In the wake of the formidable reign of Frederick the Great, a man whose discipline and precision had turned Prussia into a military powerhouse, the crown is about to pass into the hands of someone with a very different temperament, his nephew. Frederick William II. Where the old king had been lean, ascetic, and relentlessly focused on military reforms, his successor would be rounder in face, softer in build, and far more prone to indulging the pleasures of the flesh, the table, and the heart. From the very beginning, Frederick William II stood apart from the stern tradition of his predecessor. Born in 1744, he was not expected to become king so soon. His youth was spent less in the rigid drilling fields and more in the warm glow of salons and drawing rooms. Music was his first great love. He played the cello with genuine passion, enough to surprise those who expected a Prussian prince to care only for guns and marching. But along with this artistic sensibility came a hunger for the softer and more indulgent side of life. While his uncle believed in the Spartan virtue of cold barracks and simple meals, Frederick William found joy in ornate banquets, the sound of string quartets, and the perfume of beautiful women. When he ascended the throne at the age of 42, the shift was immediate. The austere military parades were still there, but they were softened with more festivals, concerts, and evening entertainments than Berlin had seen in decades. Courtiers who had grown accustomed to the almost monastic lifestyle under Frederick the Great were startled to find themselves attending late-night operas followed by lavish suppers where wine flowed as freely as conversation. The king himself was often at the center of these gatherings, leaning back in his chair with a smile, surrounded by musicians and companions whose beauty was as carefully chosen as the pieces they played. And yet, Frederick William II's reign would not merely be about art and culture. It would be about his personal entanglements. He was, in every sense, a king whose private desires spilled over into public life. From early in his reign, whispers moved through the marble halls of the palace about the king's mistresses, and unlike the whispered affairs of other monarchs, these relationships often came with official privileges. Wilhelmine Encke, for example, began as a young and charming opera singer, catching the king's eye with her lively wit and musical skill. She became not only his mistress but also an influential figure in court politics, granted estates and titles that raised more than a few eyebrows among the nobility. There was something almost theatrical about how Frederick William managed his romantic liaisons. He did not merely meet women in secret, he wove them into the tapestry of court life, placing them in positions where they could be seen and envied. His court was an open stage, where music, flirtation, and politics danced together in a sometimes scandalous performance. It wasn't only Wilhelmine. The king's tastes led him to a series of mistresses, each chosen with the same care he might use in selecting a symphony for an evening's entertainment. Some came from noble families, others from the world of the arts, but all shared a certain grace and vivacity that complemented the king's own appetite for beauty. While these romantic pursuits might seem purely indulgent, they had real political consequences. Many in the military elite, the same men who had served under Frederick the Great, looked on with a mixture of disdain and frustration. To them, the king's focus on personal pleasure weakened the iron discipline that had defined Prussia. Yet Frederick William saw himself not as abandoning his duty, but as broadening it, bringing a more human and cultured touch to the Prussian monarchy. He saw music, conversation, and companionship as vital to the health of the realm, just as much as drills and regulations. Still, the expenses mounted. The banquets, estates, and stipends given to mistresses drained the royal treasury, and even the lavish musical patronage, which brought some of the greatest performers of the age to Berlin, required heavy funding. The contrast between the simplicity of the previous reign and the extravagance of this one was stark. Soldiers muttered in taverns about how the king spent more time tuning his cello than inspecting the troops. Courtiers who had once boasted of Prussia's Spartan discipline now found themselves caught up in a swirl of courtly gossip, new fashions, and imported wines. The king's musical life, though, remained perhaps his most enduring passion. His cello was never far from him, and he often invited small ensembles to perform intimate concerts in his private chambers. Sometimes, late into the night, after the official guests had departed, he would continue playing with his closest companions, mistresses among them, as the candles burned low and the air filled with the mingling scents of tobacco, perfume, and wine. In these moments, the burdens of state seemed far away. He was not the ruler of Prussia, but simply a man surrounded by beauty, sound, and affection. And yet, the realities of kingship could not be escaped forever. As his reign went on, the political pressures mounted. Wars, alliances, and the complicated web of European diplomacy demanded attention. Frederick William, though capable of decisive action when pressed, was often accused of letting others manage the details while he remained absorbed in personal affairs. Ministers and generals sometimes found themselves waiting for audiences while the king lingered over a late breakfast or a morning cello rehearsal. The later years of his reign brought further scandal. Some of his mistresses became embroiled in intrigues that threatened to undermine not only their own positions but also the stability of the court. Accusations of favoritism, bribery, and influence peddling swirled through Berlin, and though many of these claims were exaggerated, they fed the growing perception that the king's personal life and the governance of the realm were hopelessly entangled. When Frederick William II died in 1797, he left behind a mixed legacy. To some, he was a patron of the arts, a king who brought warmth and elegance back to a realm that had grown too rigid under his predecessor. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a ruler whose appetites distracted him from the discipline and focus that had made Prussia strong. The truth, as with most human stories, lay somewhere in between. He was both, a man who loved deeply, played skillfully, and reigned in a way that reflected his own character, for better or worse. Even now, historians remember him less for his military campaigns or political reforms, and more for the glittering, music-filled world he created in his court, a world of laughter, candlelight, and whispers behind painted fans, where the boundaries between power and pleasure were as blurred as the shadows cast by the chandeliers. Chapter 9. King Peter I of Portugal, The Dark Obsessions. If you were to walk through the quiet valleys and sunlit hills of Portugal in the early 14th century, you might not suspect that behind the stone walls of royal castles, passions burned hot enough to alter the course of a nation's history. The reign of King Peter I, who would later be called a Pedro the Justo by some and a Pedro the Cruel by others, is often remembered for his stern hand in justice and his sense of fairness for the common people. Yet beneath that image lay a story of consuming love, unyielding obsession, and an act of posthumous vengeance so shocking that it has echoed through the centuries. Peter was born in 1320, the son of King Afonso IV and Queen Beatrice of Castile. He grew up in a Portugal that was finding its footing as a young kingdom, strong enough to stand independently, yet always navigating the delicate web of Iberian politics with Castile, Aragon, and the ever-present church in Rome. His early years were shaped by courtly training, lessons in statecraft, and the expected guidance of tutors who drilled into him the virtues of Christian kingship. He learned to ride, to hunt, to wield a sword with precision, and to read the histories of great rulers. But even as a boy, Peter displayed a fierce will and a certain stubbornness of heart, traits that would serve him well in war and lawmaking, but would also pull him into one of the most tragic love stories in European royal history. It began in 1340, when Peter was a young man in his 20s and newly married to Princess Constanza Manuel of Castile. Their marriage was a political union, one meant to cement alliances between two powerful Iberian houses. Constanza was beautiful, refined, and brought with her a considerable dowry. Yet Peter's attention did not linger long on his new wife. At Constanza's side, among her ladies-in-waiting, was a young Castilian noblewoman named Inés de Castro. Inés had a soft but commanding beauty, pale skin, golden hair, and eyes that seemed to draw Peter in as if they had known each other in another life. From the moment Peter laid eyes on her, something shifted. Court chroniclers would later write that it was as if a fever took hold of him, a deep and immediate infatuation. Inés, for her part, was said to have been cautious at first, knowing well the dangers of royal attention. But Peter was relentless, and soon, the two were bound together in an affair that would dominate the rest of his life. At first, their romance was discreet. They met in hidden gardens, exchanged letters by the hands of trusted servants, and stole moments in the corridors of the palace when others' eyes were turned away. Constanza, perhaps suspecting something, bore her role as queen with dignity, though it must have cut deep to see her husband's affections so clearly aimed elsewhere. But soon, the relationship could not be hidden. The court buzzed with rumors, and King Afonso began to grow uneasy. The politics of the Iberian Peninsula were fragile, and the de Castro family, Inés's kin, were tied to powerful factions in Castile that could threaten Portugal's sovereignty. The king saw in this romance not just scandal, but a potential political disaster. Still, Peter would not yield. He insisted on seeing Inés, writing poems to her, and defying the cautious advice of his council. In 1345, tragedy struck. Queen Constanza died while giving birth to a son, the future King Ferdinand I. For Peter, grief over her passing was real, but it also freed him from the constraints of a political marriage. Now he could pursue Inés openly, and he did so with a passion that alarmed his father. The lovers retreated to the royal estate at Santa Clara in Coimbra, where they lived almost as husband and wife, raising their children together. This period might have been one of happiness for Peter, but for Afonso IV, it was intolerable. Advisors warned him that Peter's obsession with Inés was placing the stability of the kingdom at risk. The de Castro brothers were suspected of influencing Peter's decisions, possibly pulling him toward Castilian interests. For the old king, the solution was as grim as it was final. Inés must be removed from the picture permanently. In January 1355, while Peter was away hunting, 3 of Afonso's trusted courtiers, Pero Coelho, Álvaro Goncalves, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco, rode to Coimbra under the king's orders. They entered the gardens of Santa Clara, where Inés was with her children. What happened next was whispered in horrified tones for years afterward. Inés was seized and executed, beheaded in cold blood. Her children were spared, but they were left motherless. When word reached Peter, something inside him broke. He was consumed not only with grief, but with a burning desire for vengeance. His love for Inés transformed into a kind of dark obsession, not just to remember her, but to honor her in ways that would shake the kingdom. He openly defied his father, waging a short-lived rebellion. Although father and son reconciled before Afonso's death later that year, Peter never forgave the men who had carried out the killing. In 1357, Peter ascended the throne as King of Portugal. One of his first acts was to hunt down the murderers of Inés. Pero Coelho and Álvaro Goncalves were captured. Diogo Lopes Pacheco escaped into exile. The punishments Peter devised were brutal, even by medieval standards. The men were executed by having their hearts torn out, one through the chest, the other through the back, a symbolic retribution for what he called their heartless crime. But the most infamous moment of Peter's reign came years later. According to chroniclers, Peter claimed that he and Inés had been secretly married before her death, making her the rightful Queen of Portugal. To prove her status, and perhaps to satisfy his unrelenting grief, he ordered her body exhumed from its tomb. The corpse, dressed in royal finery, was placed on a throne, and the members of the court were commanded to approach and kiss her hand in homage, as they would any living queen. Whether every detail of this macabre scene is strictly true remains debated by historians, but in the minds of the Portuguese people, it became an unforgettable part of the legend of Pedro and Inés. Peter ruled for a decade more, earning his nickname the Justa for his fairness in law and his defense of the common people, yet also carrying the shadow over the cruelty for the severity of his punishments and the eerie devotion to his lost love. When he died in 1367, he was buried beside Inés, their tombs placed so that, according to legend, they would face each other on the day of resurrection. Even now, in the monastery of Alcobacer, the intricately carved tombs of Pedro and Inés lie side by side, silent stone witnesses to a love that defied politics, scandal, and even death itself. Some see it as a tragic romance, others as a cautionary tale of obsession's power. But in the stillness of that grand, echoing hall, it is hard not to feel the pull of their story, a love so fierce it bent the course of kingship, and a grief so deep it reached beyond the grave. Chapter 10. King Umberto I of Italy, a royal appetite for pleasure. It was the summer of 1878 when Umberto I ascended to the throne of Italy, a relatively young man of 34 with a soldier's bearing, a carefully groomed moustache, and the kind of upright posture that made him look taller than he truly was. He came into power during a fragile moment for the newly unified Italy. The kingdom itself was still a patchwork quilt, stitched together from proud, independent regions that had been under different rulers for centuries. The north spoke in clipped, almost French-like dialects. The south retained a lyrical, almost sing-song rhythm to its speech. The people of Venice still thought of themselves as Venetians first, Italians second. Naples remained suspicious of the Piedmontese monarchy. And Rome, the Eternal City, had only been claimed from the Papal States less than a decade before, in 1870, and was still bristling under the presence of the new royal regime. Umberto was no stranger to these tensions. Born in Turin in 1844, he was the second son of Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of a unified Italy. Growing up in the House of Savoy meant that Umberto's education was steeped in military discipline, court etiquette, and a strong sense of dynastic pride. From a young age, he was trained to stand tall, to march in perfect formation, to speak sparingly but firmly, and, perhaps most importantly, to marry advantageously. His tutors also ensured that he learned French and German, for the royal courts of Europe still relied heavily on French for diplomacy, and Germany was fast becoming an important political player. Physically, Umberto was not the most imposing man in Europe, but he had presence, that ineffable quality that made people stand a little straighter in his company. His eyes were sharp and dark, his jaw was clean and square, and his moustache, waxed to a precise point at each end, seemed to speak of both military order and a touch of vanity. As a young prince, he served in the army during the wars of Italian unification. He fought at the Battle of Custoza in 1866, during the Third Italian War of Independence. That battle had been a disaster for Italy, ending in a crushing defeat by the Austrians, but Umberto's personal conduct was said to be brave, even gallant. He rode his horse across open ground under fire, issued calm orders amid chaos, and at one point personally rallied a retreating regiment. Though the war ended poorly, his reputation as a soldier was cemented. But as history often shows, a soldier in peacetime sometimes finds his energies redirected, and for Umberto, much of that energy flowed into the pleasures of the royal court. Umberto's marriage was, in many ways, a practical affair. In 1868, at the age of 24, he wed his first cousin, Princess Margrethe of Savoy. Such a union was not unusual among European royalty, who often married within a small circle of noble families to preserve dynastic ties. Margrethe was cultured, well-educated, and striking in appearance, with a regal carriage and a love of music and literature. She would later become one of Italy's most beloved queens, admired for her elegance, her patronage of the arts, and even for inspiring the naming of the Pizza Margrethe, its red tomatoes, white mozzarella, and green basil symbolizing the Italian flag. In public, Umberto and Margrethe projected an image of harmony and royal dignity. They attended state functions together, posed for official portraits, and rode side by side in grand processions. But behind the polished facade, the marriage was said to be distant. Umberto respected Margrethe, but theirs was never a love match. The king's affections were often spent elsewhere. Whispered rumors in the corridors of Rome's palaces told of Umberto's discreet yet numerous romantic liaisons. The royal court was a place where appearances mattered above all else, and Umberto was careful never to let scandal break into the open. But among those who served him, the aides-de-camp, the chamberlains, the ladies-in-waiting, It was well understood that the king enjoyed the company of beautiful women. The Italy over which Umberto ruled was a land of contrasts: glittering ballrooms in the north, sun-baked villages in the south, industrial progress in Milan, and grinding rural poverty in Sicily. The late 19th century was a time when the upper classes still lived in a world apart from their subjects, surrounded by fine silks, crystal chandeliers, and heavy velvet drapes. And within this world, kings could indulge in luxuries denied to most. For Umberto, one of his greatest pleasures was the royal hunt. He adored the ritual of it, rising before dawn, dressing in tailored riding clothes, mounting a powerful horse, and galloping through the countryside with a retinue of noblemen and guards. The hunts were social occasions as much as they were sport, with lavish breakfasts served in the field, fine wines poured into silver cups, and evenings ending in roaring fireplaces and long dinners. And often, the women invited to these gatherings were chosen not just for their family names, but for their beauty. Court gossip in Milan once whispered about a certain countess, young, charming, with eyes that seemed to laugh even when her lips did not, who became a frequent guest at the royal hunts. The king, it was said, often found a way to ride beside her, the two of them deep in conversation as their horses kept pace. Of course, no public scandal emerged, but servants spoke of private notes, of discreet carriages arriving at side doors, and of long walks in the palace gardens under moonlight. Food, too, was a passion for Umberto, and not merely in the sense of eating. He loved the theatre of dining, the ornate silver platters, the arrangement of flowers, the choreography of servants moving in perfect synchrony. At state banquets, he would insist on courses that showcased Italy's regional cuisines: delicate risottos from Lombardy, rich stews from Piedmont, fresh seafood from Naples, and pastries dusted with sugar from Sicily. It was said that he could recite, without hesitation, the names of dozens of cheeses and wines, pairing them with a skill that surprised even the court chefs. But there was also a more private side to his culinary indulgences. On certain evenings, the king would host what his inner circle jokingly called the small dinners, intimate gatherings of no more than a dozen guests, often including a select group of courtiers, musicians, and women whose presence was chosen for beauty and wit rather than political influence. These evenings were filled with conversation, laughter, music, and, always, an undercurrent of flirtation. The wines flowed freely, the courses stretched late into the night, and it was not unusual for the king to retire from the table with one particular guest lingering behind. Chapter 11. King Alfonso XIII of Spain. Cinema, Scandal, and Seduction. Spain, in the earliest years of the 20th century, was a nation standing uneasily at the crossroads of its own past and future. The golden age of exploration, empire, and unimaginable wealth had long since faded into the realm of nostalgia and history books. By the time the young Alfonso XIII stepped into the world as a newborn monarch in 1886, the Spanish Empire had lost nearly all of its overseas possessions. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, gone. The proud ships of the Armada were but ghosts in naval museums, and the Spanish court itself was trying to maintain its dignity while presiding over a country unsure of what its place in the modern world should be. The infant king was something of a national curiosity. He had been declared monarch before he had even drawn his first breath, an unusual, almost mythical circumstance that immediately surrounded his birth with a sense of destiny. His father, King Alfonso XII, had died of tuberculosis months before, leaving Queen Maria Christina of Austria a pregnant widow and regent. When Alfonso was born, he was proclaimed king instantly, a title that meant little to a newborn swaddled in silk, but everything to a people desperate for a symbolic renewal. Maria Christina ruled as regent with a strict, traditional hand. She was devoutly Catholic, steeped in the rigid moral codes of Central European royalty, and determined to keep her son from the moral dangers she saw lurking in the modern world. For Alfonso's early years, her efforts were almost comically controlling. His tutors were handpicked for their loyalty and religious piety. His playmates were chosen from the children of the most conservative aristocratic families. Even the young king's toys were scrutinized for anything that might distract him from virtue. But the problem with raising a boy in such a tightly sealed bubble is that the moment he gains freedom, he tends to burst out of it with extraordinary force. By the time Alfonso turned 16, he was already chafing under his mother's moral oversight. The modern world was changing. Telephones, automobiles, cinemas, jazz music, and a loosening of the old codes of aristocratic behavior were beginning to ripple through European capitals. Alfonso, handsome with dark eyes and a mischievous smile, was quickly seduced by this energy. When he formally took the throne in 1902 at the age of 16, he was presented as a sober young king with the future of Spain in his hands. Behind the palace walls, however, a very different portrait was emerging. Alfonso loved speed. He became an early adopter of the automobile, driving at reckless velocities through the streets and countryside, terrifying his staff and delighting young noblewomen who begged for a ride. He adored sports, bullfighting, polo, shooting, and was often photographed looking rugged and dashing, a deliberate contrast to the frail, sickly image of many 19th-century monarchs. He cultivated an air of masculine vitality that won him admirers. But it also served another purpose. It made him irresistible to women. The young king's romantic escapades began to multiply almost immediately. The Spanish court, still clinging to notions of old-world discretion, was horrified at how openly Alfonso pursued women. It was one thing for kings of past centuries to take mistresses discreetly, quite another for a modern king to be seen in the company of actresses, dancers, and socialites, especially when his country was struggling politically. But Alfonso seemed to have little patience for hypocrisy. He saw himself as a modern man, entitled to live as he pleased. And then there was his fascination with the newest art form in the world, motion pictures. Cinema in the first decades of the 20th century was still finding its identity. In Spain, small theatres were springing up in major cities, showing short films imported from France, Italy, and the United States. Some were comedies, some melodramas, and some were of a more risque nature, though a risque in 1905 was tame by modern standards. Yet Alfonso was intrigued not only by the films he could see publicly, but also by the possibilities of film as a private amusement. Whispers began in court circles that the king had been commissioning private films, and not just any films. These were explicit productions, often made in France, featuring women in provocative costumes, or none at all, shot with an eye for intimacy rather than artistry. Some claimed that Alfonso had a small projection room within the royal palace of Madrid where he would host private screenings for close friends. Others went further, suggesting that he had even involved himself in selecting actresses for these productions, sometimes under the guise of a patronage of the arts. It was scandalous, but it was also very much in character. Alfonso had an eye for beauty, a taste for the unconventional, and a streak of boldness that refused to bow to public morality. In an age when the Spanish press was heavily censored, stories about his cinematic hobby rarely made it into print. But in Paris, London, and Rome, the gossip was unstoppable. Diplomats joked about the King of Spain's film library in private letters. Aristocrats hinted at it over champagne in Monaco. The irony was that Alfonso's interest in erotic cinema wasn't entirely unique among the European elite of the time. There were plenty of wealthy men, and some women, quietly collecting such films. But for a king, especially one ruling a country still deeply Catholic and morally conservative, the optics were disastrous. And yet, Alfonso didn't seem to care. He continued to balance his public role with his private pleasures. By day, he attended cabinet meetings, presided over military parades, and played the part of the modern monarch trying to keep Spain relevant on the European stage. By night, he entertained in more intimate settings, where wine flowed, music played, and the conversation turned to matters not fit for the newspapers. His romantic entanglements became legendary. Some women were from the nobility, drawn to the thrill of royal attention. Others were actresses or dancers who found in Alfonso not just a lover, but a generous benefactor. He was known to send lavish gifts, jewelry, apartments, even cars, to women who had caught his eye. The most shocking of these affairs was the openness with which they were conducted. Where other kings might hide their mistresses behind layers of plausible deniability, Alfonso sometimes appeared with them in public, fueling speculation and feeding his image as a man who lived without apology. But beneath the charm and decadence, there was a growing sense of instability. Spain was not immune to the political tremors shaking Europe. Labor unrest, demands for regional autonomy, and the rising tide of republicanism all threatened the monarchy's survival. Alfonso's personal image, daring, modern, unapologetically indulgent, was a double-edged sword. To some Spaniards, it made him relatable, even admirable. To others, it was proof that the monarchy was out of touch, self-indulgent, and morally bankrupt. The First World War brought new challenges. Spain remained neutral, which allowed its economy to benefit from trade, but the political divisions deepened. Alfonso tried to present himself as a humanitarian, overseeing efforts to assist prisoners of war from various nations. This earned him some international goodwill, but at home, the whispers about his private life never truly went away. By the 1920s, Alfonso's reputation as a lover of women and cinema had become part of his legend. Stories circulated of wild parties, of late-night screenings, of actresses elevated to near-royal status for a season before being quietly replaced. His defenders argued that he was no different from monarchs of the past, simply more visible in an age of newspapers and gossip columns. His critics saw him as a symbol of a decadent monarchy in its twilight years. The end, when it came, was swift. In 1931, amid economic crisis and political upheaval, municipal elections turned into a referendum on the monarchy. Republican candidates swept the major cities. Faced with the choice between staying and risking civil war or leaving in hopes of sparing Spain further bloodshed, Alfonso chose exile. He fled the country, first to France, then to Italy, leaving behind not only his throne but also his beloved projection room. In exile, Alfonso lived much as he always had, with charm, style, and a touch of scandal. He never returned to Spain as king. He died in 1941 in Rome, remembered by some as a modernizing monarch who loved his people, and by others as a man whose appetites distracted him from the serious business of ruling. But among the most enduring, if unspoken, parts of his legacy was the quiet truth that in the early days of cinema, the King of Spain had been one of its most passionate and unconventional patrons. And in whispered conversations in certain circles, even decades later, there was still a sly smile when someone mentioned the Alfonso's films. Chapter 12. King Farouk of Egypt, Gluttony, Gambling, and the Last Days of a Dynasty. The summer heat in Cairo has a way of pressing down on you, heavy, unyielding, almost like the weight of history itself. In 1936, the year King Farouk took the throne, the heat seemed almost symbolic. Egypt was at a boiling point, simmering under the combined pressure of colonial influence, economic disparity, and a growing wave of nationalist sentiment. For the Egyptian people, the death of King Fuad I and the coronation of his teenage son was more than a ceremonial change. It was a rare opportunity to hope. Farouk was young, just 16, and in that youth, many imagined a kind of purity, a chance for renewal. They looked at his handsome face, his European education, his poised demeanor, and saw a leader who might bridge the gap between the traditional Egypt of their ancestors and the modern, independent nation they longed for. In the early days of his reign, Farouk seemed to embody that promise. He appeared in public with warmth and charm, speaking eloquently, smiling easily, shaking hands in crowded streets. There was an undeniable magnetism about him, a charisma that drew people in. The newspapers ran photographs of him in his military uniform, his hair neatly combed, his gaze noble and determined. This, the people thought, is the king who will guide us into a new age. But charisma, like perfume, can only mask so much for so long. Farouk's education in England had exposed him to a world of luxury that was unlike anything in his homeland. He had tasted the finest French pastries in Paris, sat in private boxes at the opera in London, and played cards in the exclusive gentlemen's clubs where fortunes could change hands over the turn of a single card. He had walked through the great department stores of Europe, where a man of means could acquire anything, from diamond-encrusted watches to imported sports cars, and he had learned to love the thrill of ownership. When Farouk returned to Egypt as king, he brought those tastes back with him, and he had no intention of tempering them. The palaces of Cairo and Alexandria became showcases for his collections, elaborate furniture imported from Europe, rare books, ancient coins, and an almost absurd number of tailored suits. Farouk had a particular fondness for watches, not just any watches, but the rarest, most intricate, and most expensive timepieces in the world. He once boasted that he could wear a different watch every day for years without repeating one. But perhaps nothing revealed Farouk's appetites quite like his dining habits. He was, quite simply, a glutton. Breakfast was not a meal for him, it was a feast. Eggs prepared in multiple styles, platters of cold meats, stacks of warm bread and pastries, bowls of honey and jam, strong tea, and fresh juices were all set before him. He ate with gusto, unashamed of the quantity. Lunch and dinner were similarly excessive, multiple courses of rich, heavy dishes, often accompanied by imported wines. By his late 20s, his once athletic figure had softened, and as the years went on, he became noticeably overweight. Courtiers whispered about the king's growing size, but no one dared suggest that his lifestyle might be harming not only his health, but his reputation. If food was one passion, women were another. Farouk's interest in women was well known, and unlike some monarchs who kept their affairs discreet, Farouk's liaisons often spilled into public knowledge. Actresses, socialites, and even ordinary women from Cairo's streets found themselves the object of his attention. There were rumors, some likely exaggerated, others very real, about how far the king's indulgences went. For Farouk, attraction often seemed less about love and more about the thrill of conquest. Yet for all his personal excesses, Farouk was not entirely without charm in governance. He could be generous, sometimes extravagantly so. He donated to charities, patronized the arts, and occasionally intervened to help ordinary citizens in dramatic, headline-grabbing ways. But these acts of generosity were overshadowed by his increasingly lavish and erratic lifestyle. The king's gambling habit was legendary. When traveling abroad, he frequented the casinos of Europe, where he played baccarat, poker, and roulette for sums that would make most men dizzy. He was known to lose hundreds of thousands in a single night without visible distress, shrugging it off as the cost of amusement. In one famous incident, Farouk reportedly lost so heavily at the gaming tables that he paid his debts with a rare and valuable diamond watch from his own wrist. Farouk also had a peculiar fascination with collecting not just rare objects, but stolen ones. The story goes that he once took a priceless pocket watch from Winston Churchill during a visit, though whether as a prank or out of genuine kleptomania, no one could be sure. He was rumored to have walked out of shops without paying, not because he couldn't afford the items, but because the act itself gave him a strange thrill. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Egypt's political landscape was changing rapidly. Nationalism was on the rise, resentment toward the lingering British influence was growing, and the people were becoming impatient with a monarchy that seemed increasingly disconnected from their struggles. Farouk, insulated by wealth and privilege, appeared oblivious to the mounting tension. His focus remained on his pleasures, while the foundations of his reign quietly eroded beneath him. The end came in July 1952, when the Free Officers Movement, led by young military men like Gamal Abdel Nasser, staged a coup. They surrounded Farouk's palace, and the king, realizing resistance was futile, agreed to abdicate in favor of his infant son, Ahmed Fuad II. The gesture was purely symbolic. The monarchy itself would soon be abolished. Farouk's departure from Egypt was both dramatic and pathetic. He boarded the royal yacht Maruser, loaded down with as many possessions as he could carry, and sailed into exile. Crowds gathered to watch the king leave, some jeering, others watching in silence as the chapter of Egypt's monarchy closed for good. In exile, Farouk lived in Europe, moving between Italy, Monaco, and France. His fortune dwindled, but he retained enough wealth to live comfortably, continuing to dine lavishly and maintain a semblance of royal life. He grew heavier, slower, but still clung to the small rituals of kingship: fine clothes, expensive cigars, the occasional gamble. On the night of March 18, 1965, Farouk dined at a restaurant in Rome. He ordered a massive meal, multiple courses, rich desserts, and reportedly ate with the same enthusiasm he had shown all his life. Moments after finishing, he collapsed at the table, the victim of a massive heart attack. He was 45 years old. The king who had once ruled Egypt, who had lived with such unrestrained appetite, died in a foreign city, far from the Nile that had flowed beside his throne. His life had been a feast, grand, indulgent, and, in the end, unsustainable. Farouk remains a controversial figure in Egyptian memory. To some, he was a charming but flawed monarch, a victim of his own excess and the shifting tides of history. To others, he was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the monarchy: self-indulgent, out of touch, and unable to rise to the demands of leadership. And so, with his passing, the era of kings in Egypt came to a final, quiet close, not with the roar of a revolution, but with the last heartbeat of a man who had lived too much, too fast, and too well for his own good. Chapter 13: King Charles II of Spain, 1665 to 1700, the last of the Habsburg curse. It is hard to picture a monarch whose very existence seemed to be a living embodiment of a dynasty's decline, but if any king could be described that way, it was Charles II of Spain. Born in the vast, cold halls of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid on the 6th of November 1661, his birth was both celebrated and quietly dreaded. Celebrated, because he was the long-awaited heir to the Spanish throne, the one who would continue the House of Habsburg's proud legacy. Dreaded, because from the moment he came into the world, he seemed frail, ill-formed, and, as whispers around the court suggested, not quite right in the mind. Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, a dynastic strategy meant to keep the royal bloodline pure, but which instead concentrated genetic weaknesses. His father, King Philip IV of Spain, was his mother's uncle. His family tree was more of a tightly wound loop than a branching line, and nature had exacted its price. By the time Charles was born, the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that made speaking and eating difficult, had reached grotesque proportions. He could barely chew his food properly, and his speech was often slurred or incomprehensible. His tongue was said to be so large that swallowing was a challenge, and his legs were thin and weak, requiring assistance to walk even in his youth. But perhaps the most damning legacy of this genetic entanglement was his infertility. Charles never produced an heir, a fact that haunted both him and the kingdom throughout his reign. From the moment of his coronation in 1665, at the age of just 4, with his mother, Mariana of Austria, serving as regent, Spain's court became a stage for endless speculation. Could this fragile boy king ever truly rule? Let alone continue the dynasty? Despite his physical and mental limitations, Charles II was king in name and title. But in reality, Spain during his reign was ruled by others, first by his mother, then by a shifting roster of ministers, advisors, and factions within the court. Yet Charles himself was far from a silent figure. He developed strange obsessions and habits that became the stuff of gossip across Europe. His fascination with relics, exorcisms, and the occult became so intense that some at court began to believe he was cursed. Charles was deeply superstitious, convinced that his childlessness was not the result of nature but of witchcraft. He underwent exorcisms, more than once, in the belief that demons were preventing him from farthering an heir. One exorcist famously claimed to have found the bones of the deity in the king's stomach, a bizarre pronouncement that Charles took as truth. He ordered investigations into alleged witches at court, even interrogating his own servants about whether they had cursed him. His personal life was no less peculiar. Charles married twice, first to Marie Louise of Orleans, a lively and intelligent French princess, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German noblewoman. Both marriages were unhappy and unconsummated, though Charles insisted otherwise. Marie Louise reportedly dreaded her wedding night, and after years of frustration, she turned to elaborate hairstyles, French fashions, and expensive entertainments to distract from her isolation in the Spanish court. Maria Anna, on the other hand, quickly realized that she could exert influence by becoming Charles's closest political advisor, and by feeding his paranoia. Court gossip about Charles's sexuality was constant. Some whispered that he had no interest in women, others that he was impotent. Medical reports from the time are vague, but they describe his genitals as atrophied and his reproductive capacity as a null. His attempts to father a child were desperate, involving charms, potions, and even pilgrimages to holy shrines, but none succeeded. Meanwhile, Spain itself was in decline. The empire that had once spanned continents was now crumbling under the weight of debt, corruption, and military defeats. Charles, distracted by his personal misfortunes and guided by self-serving courtiers, rarely acted decisively in matters of state. His court became infamous not for political brilliance but for intrigue, superstition, and decadence. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing a monarch more interested in relics of saints than in the affairs of government. Physically, Charles aged rapidly. By his mid-30s, he appeared decades older. His body was wasted, his skin pale and unhealthy, and he often suffered from tremors and seizures. He would sometimes lose the ability to walk entirely, requiring attendants to carry him through the palace. In the final years of his reign, his illnesses multiplied. Dropsy, intestinal disorders, and convulsions plagued him. Even his mind began to fail. He was known to forget basic facts and to repeat the same stories over and over to visiting diplomats. When Charles died on the 1st of November 1700, Spain mourned the passing of a king, but also the end of a dynasty. His death without an heir plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that would redraw the continent's political map. In life, Charles had been a tragic figure, a man born into immense power but cursed by the very bloodline that had given it to him. His reign was remembered less for his political deeds and more for the strange mix of superstition, sexual failure, and personal eccentricities that defined his court. It is easy, perhaps, to mock such a king. But in Charles II's haunted eyes, in his obsessive pilgrimages, in his futile attempts to produce an heir, one can see the heavy burden of a man who knew he was the last of his line. His life was a cautionary tale about the dangers of dynastic arrogance, about the fragility of empires, and about the deep, often bizarre ways in which personal failings can shape the fate of nations. Chapter 14. Sultan Moulay Ismail of Morocco, 1672 to 1727. If you were to walk the dusty streets of Meccans in the late 17th century, you might hear the rhythmic pounding of hammers against stone, the creak of wooden scaffolding, and the low, steady hum of thousands of laborious working under the North African sun. You might smell the mingling scents of cedarwood, lime mortar, and freshly tanned leather from the markets nearby. And if you followed the winding roads, past the towering city walls and heavy wooden gates, you would eventually come upon the sprawling royal complex of the man who was, by every account, one of the most formidable, feared, and oddly fascinating rulers Morocco had ever seen, Sultan Moulay Ismail ibn Sharif. The sheer scale of his presence was difficult to ignore, even for those who never stood in his company. His face was on coins, his name spoken in hushed tones in distant villages, and his will carried on parchment sealed with the royal emblem. But it was not just his reputation as a warrior or a builder that kept his memory alive. No, what cemented him in the annals of history, and in the whispered gossip of centuries, was his extraordinary appetite for women, his astonishingly vast harem, and the staggering number of children he fathered. Historians debate the exact total, but contemporary chroniclers claimed the Sultan sired well over 1,000 children in his lifetime. Some reports claim over 1,100. Even allowing for exaggeration, the number remains incredible. In fact, he still holds a place in the Guinness World Records as the man with the most recorded offspring. His palace was said to be a labyrinth of gardens, marble halls, and intricately tiled chambers, each one potentially home to one of his wives or concubines. To understand how such a man came to rule, we have to step back to the origins of his reign. Born around 1645, Moulay Ismail was a prince of the Alawite dynasty, a family that claimed direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad. This lineage was a source of great legitimacy in the Islamic world, and for Ismail, it meant that his authority could be framed as both political and religious. But legitimacy alone does not secure power. Morocco in the mid-17th century was a land divided by tribal rivalries, regional power struggles, and the lingering shadow of European coastal raids. When Ismail ascended the throne in 1672, he inherited not only the crown but a fractured kingdom. His first years as sultan were marked by campaigns to consolidate power, subdue rebellious tribes, and fortify the nation's borders. He built an elite army known as the Black Guard, composed largely of enslaved Africans and their descendants, who were fiercely loyal to him. This army became both the hammer and the shield of his rule, crushing uprisings and defending against external threats. But even as he waged war and tightened his grip over Morocco, Ismail was also setting in motion one of the most ambitious architectural projects in Moroccan history, the transformation of Meknes into a grand imperial capital. Inspired by Versailles, the palace of King Louis XIV of France, Ismail envisioned his own city of splendor, massive gates inlaid with green and white tiles, endless stables capable of holding thousands of horses, and miles of defensive walls. These projects consumed enormous resources, and some labor came through forced conscription, making him both admired for his vision and despised for his methods. Behind these public works, however, was the private world of his palace, a world that would make him infamous far beyond Morocco's borders. His harem was not merely a place of pleasure, it was a political institution in itself. Women in the harem came from diverse backgrounds, daughters of noble Moroccan families, captives taken during raids, gifts from foreign rulers, and women purchased from slave markets stretching from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa. Beauty, charm, and sometimes diplomatic usefulness determined their place in the hierarchy. The Sultan was meticulous about control. Strict rules governed the harem. No man other than the Sultan could see the women, and eunuchs were employed to serve as guards. The punishment for breaking these rules was often death. For Ismail, the harem was not only about satisfying personal desire, but also about projecting power. Each child born was a living symbol of his virility and the strength of his dynasty. Foreign diplomats who visited Morocco often wrote of him with a mix of awe and bewilderment. One envoy from France reported that Ismail demanded that any foreign bride he was offered must be of exceptional beauty, and if she did not meet his standard, he would send her away without hesitation. The French court at the time, led by Louis XIV, even entertained the idea of sending one of the Sun King's own daughters to marry Ismail, a plan that ultimately never materialized. His sheer reproductive record has led to speculation about the logistics of such a life. Some modern researchers, with an almost comical clinical curiosity, have calculated how often he would have needed to be with his partners to reach his reported numbers of children. The figures suggest that intimacy for him may have been almost as routine as state meetings. Whether this was true or a product of court legend, it added to his near-mythical persona. Yet, it would be a mistake to think of Moulay Ismail as a man entirely defined by his private life. His reign lasted an impressive 55 years, making him one of the longest-serving rulers in Moroccan history. He secured Morocco's independence from foreign influence, maintained peace within its borders for long stretches, and left behind architectural achievements still admired today. The massive gates of Bab Mansur in Meknes, completed after his death, remain a testament to his vision. However, his authoritarian style and harsh punishments also made him feared. Ismail was known for a temper that could turn violent. Chronicles tell of executions ordered for the smallest infractions, and even his own sons were not safe from his wrath if they were suspected of disloyalty. When he died in 1727, he left behind not only a fortified kingdom but a sprawling and complicated family tree. The question of succession became a tangled affair, as dozens of sons and grandsons vied for the throne. His legacy, therefore, was one of both stability and chaos, a ruler who had strengthened Morocco while also sowing the seeds of future disputes. Today, when historians speak of Moulay Ismail, they tend to pause, as if unsure which version to present first: the disciplined military leader and state builder, or the man with perhaps the most famous harem in recorded history. Perhaps the truth is that these two sides were inseparable, that the same energy, ambition, and willpower that allowed him to rule for over half a century also drove his extraordinary private life. In the quiet of Meknes, when the sun sets and the shadows lengthen over the old city walls, one can still imagine the clatter of hooves in the stables, the rustle of silks in hidden chambers, and the deep, commanding voice of the Sultan. A voice that had called men to war, ordered cities to be built, and whispered to countless women behind palace doors, a voice that, in its own way, shaped the destiny of Morocco. Chapter 15: King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Dreamer in the Shadows. The year was 1845, and the soft Bavarian hills were basking in a pale, golden light. Nestled between quiet alpine valleys, the royal palace of Nymphenburg was alive with celebration. Candles glowed in crystal chandeliers, the warm flicker reflecting off gilded mirrors and polished marble floors. Servants hurried through long corridors carrying trays of spiced wine, pastries, and sugared fruits. Musicians played softly in the background, their violins weaving delicate threads of melody through the hum of noble conversation. In the center of this splendor, a new prince had entered the world, Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm, a child whose life would be bound to beauty and tragedy, art and secrecy, grandeur and loneliness. His father, King Maximilian II, was a man of order and intellect, devoted to reform and the dignity of the Bavarian crown. His mother, Marie of Prussia, was quiet yet refined, a woman of strong will and impeccable manners. Their marriage was not one of passion but of duty, and the young Ludwig would grow up sensing that emotional warmth was often sacrificed for royal protocol. Even as a boy, Ludwig seemed to inhabit a world apart. While other children of the court ran through palace gardens laughing and shouting, Ludwig preferred stillness. He could spend hours gazing out at the mountains beyond Munich, his sharp blue eyes tracing the jagged outlines of the Alps as if they were the walls of some unreachable dreamland. He devoured fairy tales, legends, and medieval romances. He would have his tutors read him the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, of swan maidens, enchanted castles, and noble quests. At night, he sometimes wandered the halls of Nymphenburg with a candle in hand, stopping to stare at old portraits, the faces of long-dead kings and queens flickering in the dim light. By adolescence, Ludwig had developed a reputation among the palace staff, not as a troublemaker, but as a strange, ethereal presence. He was tall for his age, with delicate, almost feminine features, his skin pale from hours spent indoors, his hair a soft chestnut brown. Servants whispered that he rarely laughed in the unguarded way most boys did, as if his mind was always elsewhere. His education was thorough, as befitted a crown prince, but Ludwig showed little enthusiasm for military drills or political studies. What truly lit his soul was music, especially the works of Richard Wagner, whose compositions he first heard when he was still a teenager. The swelling chords, the thunder of the orchestra, the soaring voices of Wagner's operas seemed to open doors in his imagination that nothing else could. He began to see himself as a patron of the arts, a man destined not to lead armies, but to shape beauty. Yet, as he approached adulthood, an unspoken tension began to form in the court. Bavaria expected its future king to marry and produce heirs, to mingle in society, to show charm and vigor. Ludwig, however, avoided the company of young noble women whenever possible. He was polite, even gallant in his speech, but his heart was never stirred. He seemed far more interested in the company of certain handsome men in his personal guard or in the theatre troupe that occasionally performed at court. Rumours began to ripple through the capital. Some whispered that the young prince was a too delicate ear for the role of king, others that his passions were unusual. Though these murmurs never made it into official court records, they shadowed him for the rest of his life. When his father died in 1864, Ludwig ascended the throne at just 18 years old. The people of Bavaria adored their new king at first. He was strikingly handsome, dignified, and carried himself with an almost mystical air. But almost immediately, his reign began to diverge from the practical needs of governance. Ludwig poured his energy and the kingdom's wealth into grand artistic projects. He summoned Richard Wagner to Munich, lavishing him with financial support so the composer could complete his monumental operas. To Ludwig, Wagner was more than a genius. He was a prophet of beauty, a kindred spirit. Their relationship was passionate in its devotion to art, though historians still debate whether it crossed into romantic love. Instead of attending cabinet meetings, Ludwig would vanish into long, moonlit rides through the countryside. He took to exploring old castles at night, sometimes ordering entire halls lit by hundreds of candles just so he could wander alone in their glow. Ministers grew frustrated, but Ludwig seemed indifferent to the mundane machinery of politics. Then came his obsession with building, not practical infrastructure, but dreamlike palaces that seemed to have stepped straight out of medieval legend. The most famous, Neuschwanstein Castle, rose from the Bavarian mountains like something from a painting. Soaring towers, white limestone walls, and richly painted interiors inspired by Wagnerian myths. Ludwig envisioned it not as a seat of government, but as a private sanctuary for his imagination. But as the years passed, the king's behavior grew increasingly eccentric. He avoided public appearances, shunned diplomatic functions, and preferred the company of a small circle of trusted servants and companions, almost all of them young men of striking appearance. These relationships were close, intense, and shrouded in secrecy. Whispers about Ludwig's private life grew louder. Some said he held elaborate late-night banquets where only men were present, dressed in fantastical costumes and reenacting scenes from medieval romances. Others claimed he would give extravagant gifts, jeweled swords, fine horses, silken clothes, to his favorites. There were even stories of him taking moonlit swims in the lakes near his castles with chosen companions, an act scandalous enough to inflame gossip for months. Still, to those who knew him personally, Ludwig was not a predator or a libertine. He was shy, often painfully so, and seemed to long for companionship more than conquest. His perversions, or as his enemies labelled them, lay not in cruelty but in his defiance of social norms, his refusal to hide his fascination with male beauty, his indulgence in fantasy over duty, and his unwillingness to marry simply for politics. But the extravagance came at a cost. By the 1880s, Ludwig's building projects had drained the royal treasury. Neuschwanstein was still unfinished, yet he had already begun plans for two more fantastical palaces, Linderhof and Herrenchiemsens, each more ornate and expensive than the last. His ministers grew desperate, urging him to cut expenses, but Ludwig simply ignored them. Eventually, the political establishment decided he was no longer fit to rule. In June 1886, he was declared insane by a panel of doctors, though none had actually examined him in person. He was placed under house arrest in Berg Castle, a lakeside retreat not far from Munich. What happened next remains one of the great mysteries of European royal history. On the evening of June 13th, Ludwig went for a walk with his personal physician, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, along the shore of Lake Starnberg. Hours later, both men were found dead in the shallow water. The official report claimed it was suicide, but many have doubted that ever since. Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and there were no signs of a struggle. In death, Ludwig became exactly what he had been in life, a figure of fascination, surrounded by beauty, mystery, and speculation. His castles, especially Neuschwanstein, would go on to inspire generations of dreamers and even the fairy tale imagery of Walt Disney. Today, Ludwig is remembered not as a capable ruler, but as their fairy tale king, a man who lived almost entirely in a world of his own creation, whose loves and desires defied the rigid